Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. Today we will discuss using the law to protect Jewish students on college campuses from anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller. I was born in the Midwestern town of Elgin, Illinois, which did not have a Holocaust community. Our parents and grandparents had fled the Tsar to escape those pogroms, and yet only 25 years after the end of World War II, my U.S. Army husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany, and this fate changed our lives forever.
Alyza Lewin is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, a nonprofit organization established to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people. The Brandeis Center conducts research, education, and legal advocacy to combat the resurging anti-Semitism on college and university campuses. Alyza is also a co-founder and partner in Lewin & Lewin LLP, where she specializes in litigation, mediation, and government relations. Her experience includes criminal defense, civil litigation, and anti-discrimination matters. Alyza, we're thrilled to have you on our show. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. Alyza, can you tell us a little bit about your personal connection to the work that you're doing?
Sure. I would say that my passion for the work that I do, for trying to help protect students, as you said, from anti-Semitism, but really the Jewish community in general, really grows from my upbringing and my background. I come on my father's side from a family of a long line of rabbis. My great-grandfather was the chief rabbi in a city in the south of Poland called Rzeszów or Resha. He was known as the Resha Rav. He not only wrote a commentary on the Bible, but he was also an elected member of the Polish Sejm. And he used to speak out in the Polish Sejm against Hitler. Rumor had it that he was on Hitler's 10 most wanted list. And my father was born in Poland, and my grandparents fled in 1939 as the Germans invaded Poland. But my grandfather, when he made it to the States, he also was an educator and an activist. And my father used to talk about how he remembers my father would fall asleep to the sound of the typewriter, the manual typewriters back then, right? Of my grandfather writing article after article, particularly in the Yiddish press, trying to wake up the American Jewish community to the realities of what was actually happening in Europe. And my father, Nathan Lewin, some of your viewers may have heard of him, is really a legal legend. He's not only and as you mentioned, I founded with my father a law practice over 20 years ago. But before that, my father taught me, he mentored me. He is not only a Supreme Court advocate, a litigator, civil and criminal law, but he has always devoted a very serious portion of his professional expertise to trying to make sure that Jews in the United States can practice their faith freely and with pride. So he's argued 28 cases before the Supreme Court, which includes many religious liberty cases, such as the right to wear yarmulke in the military, or the right to put up the Chabad menorahs on Hanukkah time on the public square. And so that's the environment I grew up in. But then also on my mother's side, my maternal grandmother was born in the old city of Jerusalem when it was under Ottoman rule. And she's a 7th generation Jerusalemite. So I have family that goes back in the land of Israel to the early 1800s. And I have often felt that the two defining moments in the history of the Jewish people, in the relatively recent history of the Jewish people, combine in me. And when I would look at photographs of the Lodz ghetto, my father was born in Lodz, and I would think how close I came to being born into that reality. And yet instead I was fortunate enough to be born in America with all the blessings and opportunities that has afforded me. And I've always felt this strong sense of obligation to give back. And so to be able to actually devote my professional career to doing the kind of work I do is incredibly meaningful, and I feel very blessed to be able to do it.
Thank you
Thank you for sharing that.
It was
Yes.
really. So now let's talk about, at what point does anti-Semitism become illegal in the United States?
So anti-Semitism itself, right, is a term that doesn't constitute something illegal, like racism, right? In the United States, the First Amendment, right, when we talk about free speech, protects individuals' rights to express themselves as a bigot, right? You can say very racist things in this country and you're protected. You can say anti-Semitic things and you're protected. You can say homophobic things and you're protected. The issue is when you start to act on that, right? If you start to discriminate against a person based on their race, their color, their national ethnic origin, their religion, their gender, right? That's when it becomes unlawful. You're not allowed to turn around and take those prejudicial feelings you may have and then act on them and treat people in a discriminatory fashion. That's the issue. So people in this country, I mean, this is part of what we celebrate in America, are actually free to say some very awful anti-Semitic things. They're just not permitted to discriminate against individuals in an anti-Semitic way.
Can you
And
give
is that what happens on colleges? That there
Yes.
are illegal
So that
forms
is
of anti-Semitism going on?
Yes, you actually see both, right? You see words, right? You see anti-Semitic rhetoric, but particularly when the anti-Semitic rhetoric is ignored, then you see it escalates. And when it escalates, there's almost a pattern, right? First, it escalates and the community that's being targeted by that rhetoric is shunned. They're marginalized. They're excluded. And if that's ignored, which it shouldn't be, and we can talk about what needs to be done, then you sometimes see it escalate even more, right? You'll start to see vandalism. You may see assaults, right? You may see violence. And that's right, that's the natural progression. And if you think about, as psychologists, you think about the psychology, it's not really surprising, right? If you hear enough over and over and over again that a particular community is essentially equated with evil, and when it comes to the Jewish community, then the natural implication is, well, then the world would be a better place without these evil people, right? My club would be a better place without these evil individuals, right? Why it's a good thing for us to shun and exclude these people.
Could you give us an example of college campus where it escalated in this way?
Sure. So one of the things that we're seeing now today, unfortunately, is in addition to the traditional anti-Semitic tropes, the allegations of Jewish power or control or greed, or right, what we've seen is a rise in the demonization of Jews who feel this affinity for Israel, right? So maybe before I get to the examples, and I want to come back to the examples, maybe if we step back for a second and talk just about anti-Semitism in general, because one of the things that I find is when we talk to university administrators on campus, they don't even really understand what anti-Semitism is. So before we get to the examples of what's happening on campus, let's just talk for a second about what anti-Semitism is. So I understand that it's hard for people to recognize anti-Semitism because while it's society's most ancient evil, right, it looks a little different in every generation. Anti-Semitism morphs. And what I explain to people is that the one constant about anti-Semitism is that it doesn't matter what the generation, doesn't matter what era, anti-Semitism always takes whatever that society views as its misfortune, whatever it sees as the evil of the day, and it pins it on the Jew. The Jew becomes to blame. The Jew is the scapegoat, right? So the Jews have been disparaged over history as the Christ killer, the capitalists, or the other way around. For the capitalists, the Jews were the communists. When it came to disease during the bubonic plague or even during COVID, the Jews were sometimes blamed for being the cause or bringing the disease. And then if you think about the Nazis, right, the Nazis wanted a pure Aryan race. They didn't see the Jews as white. They actually saw the Jews as the race polluters. Today, what's the issue that our generation now feels is the evil that we all have to confront? It's racial justice. It's the issues of racism, apartheid, settler colonialism. And so now there are those who will say that all Jews, doesn't matter what their skin color, that all Jews are white, oppressor, colonialists. That's a form of anti-Semitism. The other thing is that what's new today, relatively new today in the last century, is that now, about to celebrate 75 years of the Jewish collective, we actually have a Jewish nation state. And if you realize that what anti-Semitism does is it takes what that generation views as evil and it pins it on the Jew, then you begin to understand why there are people in the world who today will say, well, which country is it that's the worst offender when it comes to human rights abuses, right? We're very focused on, again, the social and racial justice and the human rights issues. They don't point to China and the Uyghurs or Russia with Ukraine or Iran or North Korea. Instead, they say it's the Jewish state. That's the state that's the worst offender that when it comes to today's greatest evil. People don't realize that that is a form of contemporary anti-Semitism. They also don't understand that historically, what did anti-Semitism do? It othered the Jew, right? As I say, if the implication was that the world is a better place because the Jew is to blame for our misfortune, then let's get rid of the Jew and the world will be a better place. So the idea is to marginalize and exclude the Jews. Think about the yellow Star of David that the Nazis had the Jews wear. The idea was from a distance, you can recognize who that Jew is and you shun them. You don't do business with them. You don't go to their stores. You don't use them as your professionals, your doctors, your lawyers. They're to be excluded. Erwin Cutler, who is the former Attorney General and former Justice Minister in Canada, he's the current special envoy from Canada on anti-Semitism issues. He has explained that traditional anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society. Contemporary anti-Semitism, he explains, seeks to do the same thing to the Jewish collective, to the Jewish nation state. It seeks to deny it its place in the society of nations. There's no other country in the world that people say has no right to exist. Only the Jews are told you have no right to self-determination. You have no right to that one tiny Jewish state. That's contemporary anti-Semitism. And the problem is most people still don't understand that as contemporary.
And this is what college students experience?
Yes. So what's happening today is the other piece that people don't understand is what Zionism is. Because what we hear with increasing frequency today is people say, oh, I have nothing against Jews. I just don't like Zionists. And the question is, can you do that? Can you support Jews but oppose Zionists? And I say the answer to that is no. And the reason you can't is because for most Jews, Zionism is an integral part of their identity as Jews, right? Zionism reflects the fact that the Jews are not just a religion, right? The Jews are not only about religious practice. In fact, today, most Jews don't necessarily observe or practice the religious tenets, right? What makes them Jewish is that they feel that they're part of the Jewish people. And so what Judaism is it reflects that we are a people. And what makes us a people? What makes us a people is that we have a common shared history, a shared ancestry, a shared heritage. And that history is completely rooted in the land of Israel. You can't separate our Jewish heritage from the land of Israel. That's where we began. In fact, many people don't know, but in the Bible, in the Pentateuch, there are actually 613 commandments. And more than half of those commandments actually relate to the land of Israel and can only be fulfilled in the land of Israel. And they deal with more than just agriculture. They deal with the whole workings of the way of life of the Jewish people, how the court system should work, how when there were kings, how the kings should rule, how this was all about Jewish peoplehood as a nation in their land. And so what happens today is you have students on campus, and here's how it manifests. You'll have students, for example, on campus who will go on that first trip to Israel, and they'll come back and they'll say, this was transformative. This was the most amazing experience of my life. To go to a country where the national calendar is the Jewish calendar, right? I say, you don't have to worry about getting a midterm on Yom Kippur because that won't happen there, right? You can get your kosher food. The Hebrew language, our language, is the spoken language, so you can see all the logos, the school logos and the sports team logos, and everything is in Hebrew. That's our language, right? And the history, you walk on these stones that the ancient Hebrews walked on 3,000 years ago, and they come back and they say it was the most amazing trip in the world. But I would never dare put a picture of that on my social media account. I can't share that on social media.
Yeah.
I can't wear a t-shirt with Hebrew on it. I can't
Yeah.
wear a Star of David, or that ring that I bought in Israel and Jerusalem at that shop, and it's my favorite ring, and I always get complimented on it. I don't feel comfortable telling anybody where I bought it, because they know that if they share that, if they say that, they'll be shunned. I had a student who told me, when there was, now we have had recent terrorist attacks, but when there was the terror attack some months ago in Tel Aviv, and the student's brother was not far away, and she said, I can't even tell the other students here that my brother was so close to this terror attack, because if they know that I have a brother who's living in Israel, that's it. I'll lose my friends. And then what you also find is students are actually getting pushed out of clubs. We have a client at the Brandeis Center who created at SUNY New Paltz. She created a sexual assault survivor club that worked to try and get the university to make positive change and take steps to really support the survivors on campus. And they were making real amazing, doing amazing work, and the university was making changes. And then she posted on her personal Instagram account, it had nothing to do with the club, she shared an infographic that said that Jews are an ethnic group that comes from Israel, and that you can't colonize a place that you're from. And her co-chairs saw that on her private account, and they said, that's your feeling about Palestine? Well, if that's the case, you can no longer be in our club, because you're a colonialist, you're an oppressor. And they cut off her access to the Google Drive and to the social media accounts. And then they started vilifying her on social media. And it became so bad with the attacks, people threatening to spit on her and targeting her, that she left campus for the rest of the semester. She didn't feel safe on campus anymore.
Terrible.
There's a student in California. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
But you're taking this as a legal case. And could you give us the example of how, and I know the case that you're talking about what happened to her. So then what happened? She comes, let's get to the nitty gritty.
Sure. So what the Brandeis Center does is we help these students, and we help the students in New Paltz. We helped a student, for instance, also at University of Southern California, who was threatened with impeachment. Only she was a student vice president of the student body government, and she was threatened with impeachment because she was a Zionist. And so what we do is we end up using the law, because we feel and have found that the law is a very powerful motivator, and that when the universities recognize that what is happening is not a good faith political debate, but it's actually the exclusion of Jews on the basis of this integral part of their Jewish identity, they realize that they have a legal obligation to protect those students. Now, how does that work? One of the key tools we use is what's called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, what Title VI says is it applies to all the entities that receive federal government funding. Pretty much every university in the country receives some amount of federal government funds. Very small number are purely privately funded. And the idea of the Civil Rights Act was that if you're going to get money from the government, you have to make sure that whatever opportunities or services you're providing are equally accessible to everyone. You may not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national, ethnic origin. There's one hitch in Title VI, and that is that Title VI does not actually mention religion as a protected category. That was done initially deliberately because there were actually schools that were religious institutions and that were worried that if they made certain decisions based on faith, could that be interpreted as religious discrimination? So religion was actually left out. Years later, that created problems or challenges, I would say, when there were members of faith-based groups that felt they were being discriminated against. And they would file, there are two options. You can either go to court and file a federal case claiming a Title VI violation, or what most people do is they go what's called the administrative route, and they'll file a complaint with the administrative agency that oversees it. who's giving out the money. So when it comes to schools, it's the Department of Education because they're the ones giving the university money. And so there's an office in the Department of Education called the Office for Civil Rights, and they review the complaints that come in. And what happened back after 9/11, quite frankly, is that there were members of faith-based groups like Muslims and Sikhs who were filing these complaints. And initially the response from the Department of Education was, well, these are religious groups. It must be religious discrimination. We may not even have the jurisdiction to review these complaints. Ken Marcus, who is the founder of the Brandeis Center, this is before he founded it, he was then serving as the head of the Office of Civil Rights, as the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. And he said, wait a minute, that can't be right. And what he explained is that if there are faith-based groups that are being discriminated against on the basis of one of these other categories, race or color, national, ethnic origin, they don't lose that protection of Title VI just because they are also share a common faith. So he wrote that as what was called a Dear Colleague letter and explained that was the position his office was taking. That was in 2004. In 2010, in the Obama administration, when he was no longer, in the administration, the Obama administration adopted the same understanding, and the Department of Justice wrote their own Dear Colleague letter where they said exactly that. They said, and this is a quote from the letter, although Title VI does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of religion, discrimination against Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and members of other religious groups violates Title VI when that discrimination is based on the group's actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics rather than its members' religious practice. And so by 2010, this was now both Democratic and Republican administrations had understood that members of faith-based groups were protected by Title VI. What happened in 2019, when Ken Marcus was back in the administration and back in this role, is that then they issued, President Trump issued what they call the executive order on combating anti-Semitism. That brought up this understanding to the level of an executive order, applied it to all the government agencies, not just Department of Education and Department of Justice, but any agency that gives out federal money. And then what it also did is it linked Title VI with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism and said, if you want to understand what is national ethnic origin discrimination against Jews, like what does it look like? You want to understand what anti-Semitism is? This is the definition we use. And that is still today the guidance. That's it's still current on the Biden administration has just recently, just a couple of weeks ago in January, reaffirmed its commitment to this executive order, which includes IRA. So that's what's being used now. But what happens is the Brandeis Center uses this Title VI because what is the Jews' shared ancestry and ethnicity? It's our Zionism. It's our Jewish heritage. So if Jews are being pushed out and excluded because they're Zionists, that, we argue, is a violation of Title VI. And there are now 5 open investigations that the Department of Education has opened into universities on the basis of complaints that the Brandeis Center has filed on behalf of students making these claims.
That's great. So we have definition now. We have an executive order that is confirmed by the new administration. And the Brandeis Center that has enough legal basis now in the law to include Zionism in allegations of racism, basically, of discrimination.
What I explain to people is, it's true, because people will say to me, well, how can you say Zionism is integral to Jewish identity when there are some Jews who say Zionism is not a part of my identity? And I say, that's true. Not all Jews are Zionists, but by the same token, not all Jews are Sabbath observers. And yet, if you ask a Jew who incorporates any type of Sabbath observance into their life, and there's a very wide spectrum of what that might look like, if you ask them why they do that, they'll tell you, well, that's an expression of what it means to me to be Jewish. And by the same token, if you ask somebody, well, why do they feel that connection to Israel? Many of them will say, well, that is an expression also, that Zionism is an expression of my Jewish identity.
Yeah.
And just like you do not yourself have to be a Sabbath observer to understand that to say, well, we're going to exclude Sabbath observers from our club is unacceptable, right? That would be unlawful. You also yourself don't have to be a Zionist to recognize that if a person defines their Jewish identity as including Zionism as a part of that identity, then to exclude them on that basis would be similarly discriminatory.
You have to allow somebody's Jewish pride connected to Israel.
Exactly. And for these
Yeah.
Jews, you have to realize that Zionism is not an opinion. It's not a political perspective, right? If you want to have a debate on the policies, absolutely. And what's happening on the campus, unfortunately, and I'll tell you another story, is that you see that this is not a good faith political debate that's taking place, because often when the students want to have the dialogue, they're told, oh no, we won't talk to you, right? It's this anti-normalization policy. So a few years ago at NYU, for example, there was a boycott divestment. Yeah, New York University. There was a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign where they said there was a resolution, a student government resolution signed onto by 53 student organizations. That was essentially the entire progressive community on the campus. And they said, we're not only going to boycott Israeli products and companies that do business with Israel, we are also going to boycott all the pro-Israel groups on campus. We're not going to co-sponsor events with them, engage with them. We won't talk to them. So the university realized this is not a good thing. So they actually hired a professional facilitator to come to facilitate a dialogue with these groups. And they brought the representatives from all these groups in. I spoke to a student who was there at this meeting with all the representatives. And the facilitator explains, this is not going to be a debate. We're not here to try and convince anyone I'm right, you're wrong. No, this is a dialogue. We're just going to respectfully listen as each person shares their story. And what was supposed to be a 1.5 hour dialogue turns into a 2.5 hour discussion about whether the anti-Zionists would even deign to dialogue with the Zionists. They said, we came to this meeting because we didn't want to risk losing our student government funding, but you can't make a talk to them. And there was one Palestinian student in the room. And that student said, I don't understand it. The Jewish students seem to want to hear my story, but my allies won't let me tell it. And after 2.5 hours, the facilitator gave up. She couldn't force them to talk. And so then the university afterwards made an announcement, we're not going to divest from Israel, which is great. I'm glad. But that did nothing to address the interpersonal issues with the students on campus. And that's the problem. We're seeing this happening on campus. And that's why, to come back full circle to your first initial question about anti-Zionism, what's illegal, even when it's just the rhetoric, if you hear the anti-Semitic rhetoric, what's really important, and one of the things that the Brandeis Center we're also trying to educate and train universities to do, is use their own voice to speak out and to educate people and to call out the anti-Semitic rhetoric. Explain to the community why that rhetoric is so divisive and runs counter to all of the university's values of mutual respect and inclusion, right? Because if you don't call it out, if you don't show that you are standing with that community that's being targeted, and you don't awaken everybody and open their eyes to how this rhetoric is anti-Semitic, then, as we started out saying, it's just going to continue, it's going to fester, and it will get worse.
Can you give us an example? Let's take an imaginary university in which these things are going on. You know, issuing a statement that we read in the New York Times or whatever is not going to change anyone. So what should universities do to really change what's going on?
Well, I mean, one of the first things that I think universities should do as a first step is they should be willing to acknowledge that Zionism is, for most of the Jewish students, or for many of the Jewish students on their campus, a key component of their Jewish identity. And then they should be ready to enforce this when they see the discrimination. So, for example, we have one case with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And when the investigation at the Department of Education was opened, one of the first things that the university did about that same time was issue a statement, a statement on anti-Semitism. And part of it, and I'll just give you a short quote, says, for many Jewish students, Zionism is an integral part of their identity and their ethnic and ancestral heritage. These students have the right to openly express identification with Israel. The university will safeguard the abilities of these students, as well as all students, to participate in university-sponsored activities free from discrimination and harassment. That's the kind of statement that we need universities to make and then carry through on, right? Empty words are not good.
Right.
But
That's
they
my
have,
question.
exactly. They have to recognize then that if they're going to have a club, and we've had clubs, right? There was at the University of Vermont, there was also so happened to be a sexual assault survivor club there that in 2021, after the Gaza war, with the hostilities with Gaza and Hamas, they posted, this sexual assault survivor group at University of Vermont posted on their Instagram account that Zionists would be blocked because they are oppressors. There was a book club at University of Vermont that to become a member of the book club, you had to pledge no to all of these horrible things, racism and homophobia and the whole list, including Zionism. You couldn't be a part of that club if you were a Zionist. Universities have to realize that if you have things like that, that is anti-Semitic. At the University of Berkeley Law School, where you have now 14 clubs that have adopted as part of their constitution the understanding that they will not bring or have any public speakers who are Zionists. Now, no, they didn't say we don't want to have any programming on Zionism or Israel. What they said is we will not right have any speakers. So what they're saying is the women's club can't invite a pro-Israel person to speak about Roe v. Wade, or the queer club can't invite a Zionist to speak about gay marriage, right? It doesn't matter what the topic, it's the person. And what they have to understand is that if you are excluding Zionists, you're excluding most Jews. Even the law school dean acknowledged that this would prevent him and about 90% or more of the Jewish students on his campus from speaking to these clubs.
Yes, and then what happened? What I want to know is, okay, I remember that case. I remember he said it. That's fine. Then what happens?
Okay, so what happens when you use the law, what happens with these investigations is the reason the universities pay attention to the Title VI is that the way Title VI works is you're not entitled to the federal funds if the Department of Education concludes that you are discriminating. So these universities realize that they're at risk of, on top of all the negative publicity that they're getting for it, they're at risk of actually losing serious funding. They don't want that, which is why what usually happens is that the way the cases with the Department of Education get resolved is through what they call a resolution agreement, where the Department of Education says, look, these are the steps that you have to take in order to demonstrate and address effectively the discrimination. So they'll ask things like, modify your anti-discrimination policy to make sure that it covers this kind of discrimination. Make sure you have training for all the people who need to handle, right, these complaints about discrimination, to make sure that they understand, recognize the anti-Semitism and handle it effectively. Make sure that you have the opportunities and the vehicles for the students to be able to easily report this kind of discrimination, right? And one of the things that we're also telling universities is read and adopt and utilize the IRA definition, right? Because what the IRA definition does is the IRA definition incorporated essentially what were called Natan Sharansky's 3Ds. Natan Sharansky came up with the idea of how do you know when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism? That's the question that so many people ask. Because, and the IRA definition actually says the kind of criticism that's typical of the criticism that you would make against any other country, that's not anti-Semitic, right? You want to debate all the policies, what's going on right now in the government of Israel? Fine, go at it. Look at all the Israelis who are going at it. They're not anti-Semitic, right? The issue is when you engage in one of the 3Ds, demonization, delegitimization, or double standard. So if you apply the double standard to Israel or to the Jews, if you demonize, if the Israel becomes the evil, like the Jew and the traditional anti-Semitic tropes, or the delegitimization. Delegitimization is the one where you're saying Israel has no right to exist. The Jews have no right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. Those are the examples. So you want to criticize the policies. Okay, that could potentially be constructive, right? But if your idea is destructive, you just want to deny the Jews the right to a Jewish homeland. You want to deny and demand that the Jews shed this yearning for Zion, right? This belief that one day there'll be the ingathering of the exiles, right? And they'll return next year in Jerusalem, as we say on the Passover Seder on Yom Kippur. Get rid of that. Stop doing that. That Jews can't do. That's demanding that Jews give up what's an integral part to them of their Judaism. That can't be a condition. And today's society, where the idea is that we let everyone define for themselves their own identity and we welcome them to our table with their full identity, it can't be that the only identity that's denied that respect are the Jews.
Okay, but I want to go much, much lower.
Okay.
Book club. I want to join that book club. Now, how does the university make them take that question off the the list? What
So
happened?
the first thing is the students have to speak up. Okay. It is really, really important. We can't bring the cases if the students won't speak up. Now we're going to go with the chicken and the egg and the, all the way back, because the other problem is that students on campus, many students who come to campus, they don't want to fight this fight. They just want to go to school, right? And sometimes it's unavoidable. And I get that, right? I talk almost every day to students, and it's not fair, right? This is not what college is supposed to be about. At the same time, it's extremely disturbing to me when I hear students say that normal for them is hiding their Jewish identity. Normal for them is not speaking up in class, not raising the issue, not letting people know that they ever went on that trip to Israel, not letting people know, that they celebrate the Jewish holidays, not wanting, that's really not acceptable. It's not what our country wants. And what we have to get our students, and not just students, but to understand is that I think we as Jews have a responsibility to speak up about it. And it's true, it's hard because there are some, and we've had this with our clients too, who when they try and talk about anti-Semitism, there are people who say, oh no, wait a minute, now you're making it all about the Jews and you're decentering the conversation from where it really needs to be. We need to be talking about other ethnic groups. They suffer much more than the Jews. And therefore you're actually racist. You're supremacist, you're racist, by even trying to move the conversation. The problem is we know that anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish problem, right? We see that if anti-Semitism, history has shown, if anti-Semitism goes unchecked, it rots the society, right? And so all those wonderful values that we hold dear in our democracy, we're the first ones to experience it because of the way anti-Semitism works. But if we don't call it out and wake the country up, it's not going to end with the Jews, right? And
under what circumstances should students who face anti-Semitism on college campus reach out to the Brandeis Center, and how should they do that?
I think so. They should feel free to reach out to us early, because one of the things is it's not, people unfortunately think of lawyers like at the end of the road when everything's going so bad, I'll bring in the lawyer and the lawyer will sue. And the problem is, or really very often, it would have been much better if we were brought in and contacted early, because so many of the times, as I explained here, the administrators, they're just not seeing the discrimination. I'll give you an example. There was a student who, her campus, every Wednesday, the tradition was all the clubs would put out tables in the main square on campus that students knew about all the different extracurricular activities. They called it their Market Wednesday. And she was tabling for the Zionist Organization of America, for ZOA. And Students for Justice in Palestine took a picture of her, blurred her face. They put it up on social media. They blurred her face, but they said, Zionists, Zionism is white supremacy. Why are they even welcome at our Market Wednesday? So she had the picture and she said, I want to go to the administration and I want to tell them I don't feel safe, right? They put up my picture, they blurred it, but people know, they can figure out who I am. I said, that's good. You should tell them that. I said, but make sure they see the second part of this, because what are they saying to you? They're saying that, because she had said, I also don't feel safe. They're calling me a supremacist, right? That's the worst evil. I said, they're saying not only that what you view your Zionism, which is integral to your Jewish identity, is the same as supremacy, today's evil, but they're saying that on that basis, you should be excluded from the public square, from the center of campus, where everybody else is welcome to talk about whatever crazy topic they want to talk about. Only you should be kept out, right? That's the exclusion that universities are very sensitive to. They realize that's not right. And so she said, oh, right. So she talked to them afterwards. She said, it's the first time that I've ever felt heard. And it's because they saw in this now, right, that it wasn't just a speech issue. It wasn't a debate. This was actually an attempt to try and start to push out this Jewish student on this basis. And that's unlawful. And so when the students come to us, we're able to help them recognize so that when they talk to the administrators, they can use the language of harassment and discrimination. They can talk about it in a way that the university will recognize and hopefully act so that you won't need to file the case at the end of the day. But I should also say, in addition to having students or family members reach out to us, you can send an email to info@brandicecenter.com. That's one way to reach us, or there's a contact button on our website, which is at brandicecenter.com. But that also, we have a special program for law school students, because we really want to educate that demographic to be able to understand these issues, so that they can, as they go on and become lawyers, really effectively combat the anti-Semitism. But in the more immediate short term, they end up being wonderful mentors and provide tremendous support for the undergraduates, because I have found that undergraduate students are often intimidated when it comes to talking to lawyers, but to have a law student who's there as a mentor, they very much appreciate it. So we have a program for law school students where we train them in these areas of the law so that they can provide that kind of support for the undergraduates. There's a variety of law student opportunities.
That's wonderful.
That's very, very important. I'm very impressed with that, because yes, I can see as an undergraduate, you're, a little fearful, but you talk to a student who's in law school and they say, yes, I'll help you. This has been an amazing conversation, but we are coming to the end of our time. So, and I know Evelyn has more questions, I have more questions, but we want people to listen to this. We don't want to make it too long, but what is your last words that you want to say?
So I think the last words that I would leave people with is that the most important thing to remember is that the best response to harassment and discrimination is self-confidence and pride. And what we need, and I would say to your audience, whether it's students, whether it's parents, whether it's grandparents, right? What we need to do is help our students feel that confidence to express that pride. And sometimes what that means is that we need to learn more about Jewish identity. We need to feel comfortable talking about Jewish identity. We need to realize that there's so much that we as Jews have to celebrate about the richness of our identity. I tell students, do you know that the social justice issues, they started with the Jews. The Jews are the ones who introduced the whole concept that humankind is created in God's image. That's where these principles of equality came from. That was radical and novel when the Jews introduced it to the world. And you look at today, how much the Jews contribute to society in all fields: medicine, science, high tech, art, you name it, right? We need to be proud as a people. We need to feel proud as the Jewish people. And we need to be able to say to folks, I am proud of who I am, and don't push me to try and hide or shed that in order to engage in all of these issues that I feel strongly about. I can be a Jew and a feminist. I can be a Jew and support, immigration issues, climate change issues, all of those issues. I have a right to do that and openly be a proud Jew. So just remember, the best response to harassment and discrimination is self-confidence and pride.
Thank you. That's a wonderful closing. And thank our audience for listening. And I hope you are inspired by our speaker, because I know Evelyn and I are very inspired. Those of you who have not yet watched the documentary Never Again Is Now, starring Evelyn, do see so on Amazon or YouTube, because it addresses some of these issues. And I have a nonfiction theater project, thinedgeofthewedge.com, which talks about some of these issues historically and gives you some ammunition for knowing more about your Jewish heritage. And as we end every episode, we say, without putting yourself in physical danger, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate. Thank you.